No one said the word unwanted, but it hung around the boy like coal smoke. He stood on the train platform, a ghost the townsfolk simply drifted around, their eyes sliding right past him. He was thin, 9 years old if he was a day, with a patched coat that didn't quite reach his wrists. A small satchel banged against his knee with every gust of wind. In his hand, pinched between fingers that had learned not to shake, was a torn train ticket. That ticket was his whole world. The conductor, a man with a voice like gravel, called names from a thick leather ledger. With every name, a pair would step forward. A smiling couple, a stern-faced rancher, a woman with duty pressed into her thin lips. A small hand would find a bigger one. A child would be claimed. Each name called was another door shutting, leaving the boy, Nathan, on the outside. Finally, the list was done. The sounds of new families murmuring about chores and new shoes faded away. Only one boy was left standing. The conductor's voice grew rough. "Nathan," he called out, not bothering to look up from the book. "Nathan Cole." The boy just nodded. He learned a long time ago that smiling didn't get your name written down where it mattered. "Too slight for farm work," a woman in a stiff bonnet sniffed to her husband. "Got a cough," a man muttered, though Nathan hadn't made a sound. Folks don't need proof when they've already made up their minds. Standing at the edge of the crowd was a man named Jacob Hale. He was broad-shouldered, uneasy, a man who looked like he'd buried love once and wasn't about to invite it back into his house. But beside him, his little girl, Eliza, was practically vibrating. She stood on her toes, her braids a mess, her eyes bright and fierce. She had the kind of mercy that didn't wait for permission. "We'll just look, Eliza," Jacob had told her that morning. It was a lie, a kind one, meant to protect them both. He'd been telling himself the same lie all week, and it tasted more sour each time. The conductor slammed the ledger shut. The sound was final, like a hammer on a coffin nail. He tapped the torn ticket in Nathan's hand with the tip of his pencil. "No claimants," he announced to the last few lingering onlookers. His tone was flat, like he was announcing the price of feed. "He'll return east on the evening train." The words hit Nathan like a punch to the gut. His hand spasmed, crushing the ticket, but his eyes just went dim, like a lamp in a sudden draft. Someone in the crowd let out a soft, polite laugh. The kind people use when they see cruelty but don't want to seem improper. Eliza went rigid. In a flash, she slipped away from her father's side. Before Jacob could even draw breath to stop her, she was a tiny storm moving across the platform. She grabbed Nathan's wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong, a grip that said she was older than her 7 years. "Don't go," she said, her voice high and trembling. "Don't you get back on that train." She looked up at her father, her eyes pleading. It was the same look that had broken him once before, on another platform, when another train whistle had carried his wife away forever. Nathan just blinked, startled by the touch. He looked at her hand on his wrist as if it were a foreign object. "Miss," he said, his voice quiet and careful, like he expected to be punished for speaking. "They don't keep boys that no one wants." But Eliza's chin shot up. She hadn't learned yet that the world ran on ledgers and numbers. She turned to face the conductor's iron glare, the town's judging eyes, and her own father's face, which was a mask of fear and a desperate need to protect. Then she leaned in close to Nathan's ear, so close he could smell the clean scent of soap and wood smoke from her hair. She whispered a single sentence. It wasn't loud, but it moved through the station like a church bell. "He's my brother." That whisper was louder than any shout. It named something no ledger could account for. In the silence that followed, Jacob felt an old promise warring with a new one in his chest. The conductor's mouth thinned into a hard line. The whole town seemed to draw one collective, scornful breath, and Nathan's fingers, for the first time, loosened their desperate grip on the torn ticket. Eliza, still holding his wrist, turned her tear-filled eyes to her father. She wasn't pleading anymore. She was declaring, "Papa!" And far down the tracks, a train whistle blew, a sharp, questioning sound that meant time had just run out. The conductor's bark still hung in the air when Eliza did something that shocked everyone. She snatched the torn ticket from Nathan's hand. The paper fluttered for a second, a fragile bird trying to escape, before she crushed it to her chest. "He's not going," she declared. Her voice was high, but it didn't shake. Her whole small body trembled with the sheer force of what she was doing. Gasps rippled through the last of the crowd. The townsfolk who had stayed behind to watch the sad end of the spectacle now leaned in, their eyes hungry for a bit of daylight drama. Nathan stared at her, his eyes wide with a kind of fear. It was as if no one had ever taken something of his and called it theirs to protect. The conductor took a step forward, his frown deepening. He had his ledger tucked under his arm like it was the word of God. "Little miss, you've no authority here," he said, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Jacob went stiff. The eyes of the town were like pins holding him in place. He could already hear the whispers. Hale's gone soft, letting his daughter play mother to a beggar boy. The bitterness tasted like rust in his mouth. "Eliza," he said, his voice low and sharp with warning. She didn't let go of the ticket. She just turned her gaze up to him, her eyes fierce through a blur of tears. "Papa, you said truth matters more than what people say." "Well, the truth is he's my brother now. It doesn't matter if they write it down or not." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. They sounded so much like his late wife, that same stubborn grace that had seen them through lean winters and hard times. Nathan's lip began to tremble. His small shoulders shook as if the sudden weight of belonging was heavier than rejection had ever been. "No one's ever said that," he whispered, the words raspy, like they'd been locked away for a long time. The conductor, losing his patience, reached for the ticket, but Jacob's hand shot out first. It was faster than anyone expected. His big calloused hand closed over his daughter's, covering the crumpled piece of paper she held so tightly. The crowd went dead silent. Every single person was watching to see what he would do. Would he pry her fingers open, or would he let her stand? For a long moment, the only sounds were the hiss of steam from the engine and the frantic pounding of Jacob's own heart. Then he spoke. His voice was gravelly, thick with the battle between his fear and his conscience. "One more day," he told the conductor. "He stays until I decide." The platform erupted in murmurs. Some were scornful, some were shocked. A few people in the back nodded silently. The conductor puffed up his chest, ready to argue, but Jacob's stare stopped him cold. It was as unmovable as the iron rails beneath their feet. "One day," the man finally conceded, his voice grudging. He turned and strode away, the ledger thumping against his side like a constant, unspoken threat. When he was gone, Eliza let out a shaky breath that was half victory, half relief. She carefully placed the ticket back into Nathan's palm and curled his fingers around it. She gave him a smile that wobbled but held firm. "See," she whispered, "you don't belong to the train anymore. You belong to us." Nathan stared down at the ticket in his hand. It was no longer a sentence of exile. It was a promise, a covenant. His eyes shone with a new light, a light that made Jacob's throat tighten. The crowd began to drift away, the gossip already spilling out into the main street. But Jacob could feel a storm gathering. Not a storm of rain and wind, but one of whispers and judgment that would be beating against his door by morning. He lifted Eliza into his arms. Nathan trailed close behind them, the torn ticket now clutched like a holy relic. As they walked away from the station, Jacob couldn't help but wonder which would be heavier, the town's scorn or the fragile, fierce brotherhood his daughter had just willed into existence. He told himself he had only bought them one more day, but deep in his bones, a terrifying thought took root. He knew the decision had already been made. It wasn't written in a ledger. It was written in the defiant cry of a little girl who refused to be ignored. By the time they reached the Hale Ranch, dusk had bled across the plains, turning the sky to bruised purple and orange. The lantern on the porch cast a single trembling circle of light, like a secret that was afraid to be told. Nathan walked a few steps behind Jacob and Eliza, that torn piece of paper still clutched in his hand. He was terrified that if he let it go, he might vanish. His satchel, pitifully light, thumped against his hip. Inside there was nothing but a threadbare change of clothes and a small, heavy tin button he kept polished like it was a gold coin. The kitchen smelled of beans and fresh bread. It was the simple smell of supper, but to Nathan, it was the most intoxicating perfume he had ever encountered. He stopped dead on the threshold. He curled his bare toes against the rough wood of the porch. half expecting the house itself to reject him, to spit him back out into the night. But Eliza wouldn't have it. She grabbed his arm and pulled him forward with all the confidence of a general leading a charge. "Sit," she commanded, pointing to the bench next to her own stool at the small kitchen table. When he hesitated, she gave him a gentle shove, forcing him to obey. Jacob didn't say a word. He just hung his hat on its peg and lit another lamp, his face a mask of stone. He ladled beans into 3 bowls. He slid one across the table to Nathan, and then watched, his eyes sharp. The boy just stared at the bowl. He looked at it like it was a trap, something that would be snatched away the moment he reached for it. "Eat," Jacob muttered. His voice was gruff, but there wasn't any cruelty in it. Nathan picked up the spoon. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely manage it. He took the first bite. As the warm, savory taste of the beans hit his tongue, his eyes squeezed shut, as if he was afraid he might wake up from a wonderful dream. Eliza leaned in close, her rag doll Sparrow tucked under her arm. "See, he likes it," she whispered conspiratorially to her father. "He's been hungry, Papa. Can't you tell?" Jacob just grunted. He felt a flood of words rising in his throat, but he forced them down. He'd seen hunger before. He'd seen it in the hollow eyes of soldiers during the war, and in the gaunt faces of his neighbors during hard winters. But seeing it in a child at his own table was a different kind of wound. Nathan ate with a slow, cautious rhythm. Each bite was a test. He seemed to be waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the next spoonful to be denied. When he was finished, he set the spoon down so gently it didn't make a sound. "Thank you," he whispered, so softly Jacob almost missed it. The silence in the kitchen was thick. The only sound was the gentle hiss of the lamp. Then Eliza broke it. She slammed her doll, Sparrow, down on the table with a loud thud, as if she were a judge passing sentence. "He's my brother now," she declared, her voice ringing with conviction. "Brothers eat at the same table." Jacob froze, his own spoon halfway to his mouth. He wanted to tell her she was being foolish. He wanted to explain that words couldn't change blood, and they certainly couldn't silence the wagging tongues of an entire town. But when he looked into her eyes, he saw it. The same fire that had burned in his wife's eyes. The fire that had convinced him he could build a home in this harsh, unforgiving land. He swallowed hard. The beans suddenly tasted like ash. Nathan ducked his head, trying to hide the tears that were now streaming down his face. He fumbled in his pocket for the torn ticket, his fingers closing around it. The sharp edges dug into his palm, and the small pain was a comfort. It was proof that this was real. Jacob pushed his bench back from the table. The legs scraped loudly against the floorboards. He strode to the open doorway and stared out into the vast, dark night, as if the answer he needed was written in the stars. He told himself it was just one meal, just one night. By morning, he could still take the boy back. He could fix this. But Eliza's words echoed in his head, relentless and unyielding. "Brothers eat at the same table." He gripped the doorframe, his knuckles white. His heart was hammering against his ribs. Behind him, he heard a small scraping sound. He glanced back and saw Nathan carefully tucking the torn train ticket under his empty bowl. It was a small gesture, but it was a powerful one. It was as if the boy was saying that the ticket no longer belonged to the railroad or to a ledger in some far-off city. It belonged here, at this table. Jacob stood in the doorway, caught between the darkness outside and the fragile light within, and he had the terrible feeling that the choice he thought he still had was already gone. Morning broke sharp and cold. Far across the prairie, the whistle of the eastbound train drifted on the wind. It was a faint, mournful sound, a reminder that time was running out. Nathan was already awake. He sat stiffly on the bench by the door, the torn ticket spread out on his knee. He was carefully smoothing out its creases with his small, chapped fingers, as if by making the paper perfect, he could somehow fix his own broken place in the world. Eliza was a small, fierce shadow beside him. She had Sparrow tucked under one arm, and her other hand was gripping Nathan's sleeve like a vice. "You're not going," she repeated, for what must have been the 100th time. Her voice was a hushed, determined whisper. It was a prayer she refused to let die. Jacob moved around the kitchen like a man in a bad dream. He poured coffee that tasted like dirt. his eyes darting towards the boy and then quickly away. He was afraid that if he looked too long, he'd be caught in a trap he wasn't ready for. Then came the knock. 3 hard official raps on the door that made the whole cabin seem to shudder. Jacob's heart sank. He opened the door to find the conductor standing on his porch. The man's face was grim, his hat pulled down low. He had the ledger tucked under his arm. It looked less like a book and more like a weapon. "Morning, Hale," the conductor said, his voice flat. "I've come for the boy. The eastbound leaves in an hour. Best bring him down." Jacob squared his shoulders, trying to block the doorway. He could feel Eliza's gaze burning into his back. "I told you," he said, his voice tight. "He stays the day." The conductor's mouth hardened into a thin, merciless line. "The day's done. He rides now." Nathan seemed to shrink on the bench. He clutched the ticket so hard his knuckles turned white. The paper crackled, a dry, brittle sound like breaking bones. In a flash, Eliza was on her feet. She planted herself directly between the conductor and Nathan. Her braids were wild. Her chin was lifted high. "He's not leaving," she shouted, her voice ringing through the quiet morning. "He's my brother." A gasp came from the edge of the property. A pair of neighbors had been loitering by the fence, pretending to fix a loose rail. Their eyes were wide, eager for a scandal they could carry back to town. The conductor's eyes narrowed. He looked more tired than angry. "Child," he said, his voice laced with pity. "Feelings don't write names in ledgers. Blood and law do. If no one claims him proper, the train claims him. That's how it is." Eliza's face flushed a deep, furious red. Hot tears streamed down her cheeks, but she didn't budge. She reached back, snatched the ticket from Nathan's trembling hand, and held it up high, like a banner in a battle. "Then here's his proof," she cried, her voice cracking with emotion. "He belongs here with us, and I won't give it back." The words cracked through the air like a whip. For a moment, even the nosy neighbors fell silent. They were all captivated by the sight of this tiny girl, defying the law with nothing but a worthless scrap of paper and a heart full of fire. Jacob's chest felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. He saw his wife's face, her last breath. He heard Eliza's small cries in the night after she was gone. He had sworn to himself he would never let another wound into their lives. But watching his daughter, trembling but unbroken, he felt something inside him shift. The conductor's jaw was working, his gaze flicking back and forth between the girl and her father. "Well, Hale," he demanded, "you gonna let her speak for you, or are you gonna speak for yourself?" The question landed with a heavy thud, not just on the porch, but deep in Jacob's soul. He looked at Nathan, at the boy's eyes which were pleading without daring to hope. He looked at Eliza, clutching the ticket like it was the most precious thing in the world. He opened his mouth to say no, to end it, to close the door on this whole mess before it cut them all to pieces. But the word got stuck in his throat. It was choked off by the sight of his daughter's fierce, unwavering resolve. "One more day," Jacob said. His voice was rough as gravel, but it was loud, louder than before. It was meant for the neighbors as much as for the conductor. "He stays." The whispers started immediately, sharp as knives. The conductor let out a long, frustrated sigh. He snapped his ledger shut and took a step back. "One day more," he said grimly, "but you'll answer for it when the town comes calling." He turned and walked away, his boots crunching in the dry dirt. Eliza carefully pressed the ticket back into Nathan's palm. "See?" she whispered fiercely. "You're still ours." Nathan clutched the paper to his chest, his eyes wide with a fragile, disbelieving hope. And Jacob stood rooted in the doorway, knowing with a terrible certainty that the fight was no longer about a train or a book. It was about him, against the weight of every judging eye in town, all of them just waiting to see him break. By midday, the story had caught fire. It raced down the main street of town, carried on whispers and scornful laughter. In the mercantile, women bent over bolts of fabric, their voices low and sharp. "Hale's girl, can you believe it? Claimed that stray boy as her own brother." Another voice, laced with cruel amusement, answered, "Held up his train ticket like it was holy scripture." At the blacksmith's forge, a man spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Mark my words, Jacob's gone soft in the head. A man who lets a child run his house has no business running a ranch." The gossip spread like a disease. By the time Jacob steered his wagon into town for flour and nails, with Eliza and Nathan on the seat beside him, it felt like the whole world was watching. Nathan sat huddled close to Jacob, the torn ticket folded neatly in his pocket. Every few seconds, his fingers would brush against it, a secret, desperate touch. Eliza, on the other hand, sat straight and tall. Her doll, Sparrow, peeked out of her satchel, and her chin was lifted in a way that dared anyone to say a word. The boardwalk creaked under their feet as they walked towards the mercantile. The whispers followed them like a swarm of angry bees. A pair of women standing by the door clucked their tongues loudly. "That poor child," one of them said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Tied to a beggar boy. She'll ruin her name before she's even grown." Eliza froze. Her small hand tightened on Nathan's wrist. "Papa," she said, her voice loud enough to carry across the street. "They're lying. He isn't a beggar. He's my brother." The words cut through the midday noise. Even the horses hitched to the rail seemed to fall silent. Jacob stiffened. He could feel the weight of 100 eyes pressing down on him, and he felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. He wanted to tell her to be quiet, to not make things worse, but her defiance was a fire, and it burned brighter than his fear. He pushed through the door of the mercantile, his shoulders squared, daring anyone to get in his way. The shopkeeper, a man named Henderson, was in the middle of weighing out a bag of sugar. He stopped, his hand hovering over the scales. His eyes flicked from Nathan's ragged coat to Eliza's fierce, tear-streaked face, and finally to Jacob's storm-dark expression. "Afternoon, Hale," he said, his voice careful, neutral. "Looks like you've got another mouth to feed." Jacob's jaw tightened. "Put it on my account," he said, his voice clipped. Henderson nodded slowly. He seemed to be weighing the value of Jacob's credit against the risk of the town's disapproval. After a long moment, he filled the order without another word. Nathan stood silently by the counter, his head bowed. But then Eliza did something unexpected. She took Sparrow out of her satchel and quietly slipped the doll into his hands. He looked down at its lopsided, stitched-on smile, and a faint, hesitant smile touched his own lips. Back outside, the whispers started again, louder this time. Down the street, the sheriff appeared, his stride slow and deliberate. He was heading their way. Jacob felt the town's attention tightening around them like a noose. He placed a steadying hand on Nathan's shoulder and another on Eliza's back, guiding them towards the wagon. He tried to shield them with his own body, but a man's voice, loud and full of contempt, broke through the murmur. "If Hale wants to take in strays, he should do it proper. Else he shames us all." Jacob spun around. His voice was a low growl that carried like thunder. "You'll not shame my child for showing mercy," he snarled. "Not while I'm still drawing breath." A thick, uneasy silence fell over the street. It was broken only by the hiss of the blacksmith's forge and the nervous rustle of women's skirts. Eliza pressed closer to Nathan, holding Sparrow between them like a shield. "Don't be afraid," she whispered. "Papa won't let them take you." Nathan clutched the doll, the paper in his pocket crinkling against his leg. It was a fragile defense against the judgment of an entire town. As they climbed back onto the wagon, Jacob saw the faces watching them. Some were filled with scorn. Some held a flicker of something softer, something like pity or confusion. But they were all waiting, waiting to see if he would bend, waiting to see if he would break. The horse snorted, its hooves striking sparks against the dusty street. And Jacob knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that this was no longer just about whispers and gossip. A fire had been lit, and he didn't know if it would light their way forward or if it would burn his whole world to the ground. That evening, the prairie was quiet. The only sounds were the buzz of cicadas in the tall grass and the scrape of Nathan's spoon against his bowl. The silence inside the house was heavy, thick with unspoken fears. He ate slowly, deliberately, as if each bite was a treasure he had to savor, because he knew it might be his last. The torn ticket was on the table beside his plate, folded into a neat, worn square. Eliza was pressed up against him, her small shoulder touching his. Her doll, Sparrow, was propped up between their bowls, a silent, watchful guardian. Jacob ate with his eyes fixed on the grain of the wooden table, his jaw tight. He was halfway through his meal when a firm knock rattled the door. A cold dread coiled in his stomach. He rose, his movement stiff, and opened it. Sheriff Langley was standing on the porch. His hat was pulled low, his face etched with weariness and the heavy weight of his authority. "Evening, Hale," he said. His voice was like gravel on a long, hard road. "The town's restless. I've had a dozen people in my office today. They're all telling me you've taken in a boy no one claimed." Jacob stood his ground, his hand braced on the doorframe. "He earns his keep," he said, his voice hard. "That's my business." The sheriff's gaze slid past him into the warm light of the kitchen. He saw Nathan, frozen in his seat, his spoon clutched in his hand. He saw Eliza, glaring at him with the ferocity of a cornered animal. "The child calls him brother," Langley said flatly. "That makes it more than just work, Jacob. And you know it. Folks are scared you're making up your own rules. And rules are what keep a town from tearing itself to pieces." Jacob's voice dropped to a low growl. "Rules without mercy are just walls. They're meant to keep decent folks out and hearts cold." The sheriff took a step closer, lowering his own voice. "Walls or not, you know this county. It doesn't forgive easily. You either adopt him proper, with papers and a judge, or you send him back. This in-between thing, letting your daughter name him kin on a whim, that'll bring ruin on you faster than a drought." In his seat, Nathan shrank. His fingers crept towards the ticket on the table. It was his only proof of who he was, and he had a feeling he was about to need it. Eliza pushed her stool back and marched to the doorway. She had Sparrow clutched in her fist. "He's already ours," she declared, her chin high, though her lip was trembling. "You can't make me unsay it. Sparrow heard me say it." The sheriff's stern expression faltered for a second. A flicker of surprise, maybe even amusement, crossed his face before he sighed. "Child," he said, his voice softer now. "Words have weight. Once you put them out into the world, you can't just take them back." Jacob placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. It was a steady, protective gesture. His voice was iron. "She spoke the truth," he said, looking the sheriff straight in the eye. "You want to know if I claim the boy? Then hear me now. For tonight, he eats at my table. Tomorrow, tomorrow we'll see." Langley studied him for a long moment, the lines on his forehead deepening. "Tomorrow won't be good enough for them, Jacob. They're going to demand an answer, and they're going to demand it soon." He tipped his hat and stepped back into the growing darkness. "Don't let a child's whisper cost you more than you can afford to pay." His boots crunched on the gravel path as he walked away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy warning hanging in the air. Jacob closed the door slowly and leaned his back against it, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Eliza immediately went to Nathan's side and took his hand. Her small fingers were trembling, but her grip was like iron. Nathan looked up at Jacob, a fragile, desperate hope flickering in his eyes like a candle in a storm. Jacob's gaze fell to the ticket on the table. Its torn edge caught the lamplight, looking like a fresh wound that refused to heal. He knew the sheriff was right. The words had been spoken. They couldn't be unsaid. And his daughter's whisper now carried the weight of law in the eyes of the town. The night settled over the prairie, as heavy and final as a judge's sentence. Jacob felt the choice, the real choice, pressing in on him, getting closer with every tick of the clock. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, sounding like a jury that had not yet reached its verdict. And inside, Eliza held Nathan's hand, as if her grip alone could write the name that the world had refused to. The next morning, it was clear the town would not wait for Jacob's decision. It had gathered itself into a single, sharp-edged voice, and it was a voice he could no longer ignore. Word came, carried by a neighbor who wouldn't quite meet his eye, that the ranchers and shopkeepers had called a town meeting at the hall. His name wasn't on the summons, but he knew. It was for him. He hitched the wagon at dawn, his shoulders rigid with a tension that was almost painful. Eliza and Nathan stood on the porch, two small, silent figures in the gray morning light. Nathan clutched the torn ticket in his fist, his knuckles white. It was his only lifeline. His eyes were wide with a dread that made him look even younger than 9. Eliza pressed her doll, Sparrow, into his free hand. "She'll listen for you," she whispered fiercely, "while Papa listens for us." The sight of them, so small and so brave, sent a sharp pain through Jacob's chest. But he climbed onto the wagon seat without a word. A promise he couldn't bring himself to say aloud caught in his throat. The hall was already packed when he arrived. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, dust, and anger. Lamplight flickered off of stern, unyielding faces. Sheriff Langley stood at the front, his hat in his hands, his expression grim. The low buzz of conversation died the moment Jacob stepped through the door. Every eye in the room turned to him, and he could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. A big red-faced rancher named Coulter shouldered his way to the front. "We hear tell your girl claimed a stray at the station," he boomed, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "Called him brother in front of half the town. Is that true, Hale?" Jacob kept his jaw clenched, his eyes locked on Coulter's. She spoke what was in her heart. A wave of cruel, derisive laughter rippled through the room. A woman in a gray bonnet sniffed loudly. "He's no brother. He's a mouth to feed, and nothing more. If we let this stand, every vagrant child from here to the Mississippi will be crying kinship and stealing the bread from honest folks' tables." Langley raised a hand for quiet, his gaze never leaving Jacob's face. "You know what they're saying, Jacob. If you mean to keep the boy, you have to do it by the law. If not, I have to send him back. This business of keeping him in the shadows, letting a child's whim decide his fate, it tears at the very fabric of this town." Jacob's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Fabric?" he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You call it order to mock a boy until no one dares claim him? You call it order to shove him back on a train like a piece of unwanted freight? If that's your order, then I'll take shame over it any day." The room erupted. There were gasps of shock and angry jeers. Coulter spat on the floorboards. "Big words, Hale, but words won't fill your storehouse come winter. We won't have one man's foolish pride dragging this whole town into scandal." The angry murmurs swelled until Langley slammed his palm down hard on the lectern. The sharp crack silenced the room. "Enough!" he roared. "We'll not settle this with shouting." He turned his attention back to Jacob, his voice heavy with a final warning. "One way or another, the town will have its decision before the week is out. You can face it here, among your neighbors, or you can face it on the platform, with half the county watching you. The choice is yours." Jacob felt the press of every eye, the scorn as heavy as chains. But beneath the anger, he saw something else. He saw flickers of doubt, troubled expressions on faces he had known his whole life. It was as if Eliza's small act of defiance had unsettled them more than they were willing to admit. He turned and walked out of the hall, their whispers chasing him like a pack of wolves. Outside, the morning sun was bright, almost blinding. It felt wrong, too bright for the darkness that had settled in his chest. The wagon was where he'd left it. When he climbed onto the seat, he found Eliza and Nathan sitting there, waiting for him. They hadn't gone home. They had waited. "Did they listen, Papa?" Eliza asked, her voice trembling with a hope that was almost painful to hear. Jacob picked up the reins. His hands were shaking. "They'll listen," he said, his voice grim. He knew what it meant. It wasn't about mercy anymore. It was about a trial. The horse started forward, its hooves striking sparks from the hard-packed earth. And Jacob felt the town's verdict rushing towards him with every turn of the wheel, a storm that would demand more than just words. It would demand a choice that no ledger and no law could ever erase. The week wasn't even over before the town demanded its final answer. And so, on a hot Saturday afternoon, Jacob Hale found himself walking toward the train station one last time. Eliza was at his side, her hand gripping his tightly. The boy, Nathan, trailed a few steps behind. Word had spread like a floodwater. Ranchers had left their fields. Shopkeepers had closed their doors. The platform was swollen with people, packed shoulder to shoulder, their eyes sharp with a hungry need to see how this would end. The steam engine hissed on the tracks, impatient. Its smoke curled up into a sky that was too bright, too blue for the ugliness that was about to unfold. Nathan clutched the torn ticket in his hand. The paper was limp with sweat, trembling with the frantic beating of his own heart. Eliza squeezed his hand, her doll, Sparrow, pinched under her arm. Her face was a mask of fierce determination, but tears glistened at the corners of her eyes. Jacob walked tall, his hat in his hand, his jaw set like stone. He could feel the tide of public opinion rising, and he knew it was about to break against him. Sheriff Langley stood near the conductor, his arms folded across his chest, his expression unreadable. Coulter, the rancher who had been the loudest voice against him, stepped forward. His face was red with triumph. "Here's the boy no one claimed," he boomed to the crowd. "The ledger says he goes eastbound, and eastbound he will go. Stand aside, Hale." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The conductor opened his ledger with a loud snap, his pencil poised like a judge's gavel. "Nathan Cole," he called out, his voice flat and final. "Unclaimed. The train departs." The boy shrank, his eyes fixed on the dusty planks beneath his feet. But before Jacob could move, before he could say a word, Eliza shot forward. Her voice rang out, high and breaking with grief and fury. "He is claimed!" she cried. She thrust Sparrow into Nathan's hand and grabbed his sleeve with her other. "He's my brother, and I won't let you take him." The words struck the crowd like a physical blow. There were gasps, a few sharp, cruel laughs, but many people shifted uncomfortably, glancing at their neighbors. Coulter sneered, spitting into the dirt. "A child's fancy isn't the law, Hale. A little girl is no ledger." But then Nathan did something no one expected. Trembling from head to foot, he pulled the torn ticket from his pocket and held it up. His voice was ragged, but it was clear. "It's not mine anymore," he said, pressing the crumpled paper into Eliza's hand. "She keeps it now. She's the only one who ever wanted it. The only one who ever wanted me." A profound hush fell over the platform. The only sound was the hiss of the engine. Jacob felt the moment sear itself into his soul. The choice he had been trying to outrun had finally caught him. He stepped forward. His voice boomed across the platform, filled with the pain of a man who had buried love once and would be damned before he did it again. "Ledger be damned," he thundered, his voice raw with emotion. "My daughter spoke the truth, and I will not see her shamed for it. This boy eats at my table, he sleeps under my roof, and by God, that makes him mine." The platform exploded with noise. There were shouts of outrage, gasps of disbelief, but there were also a few scattered shouts of approval. Langley raised a hand, and slowly the crowd fell silent. He studied Jacob for a long, hard moment. Then his gaze swept over the crowd. "You heard the man," he said, his voice carrying a new authority. "A house has claimed the boy. The law can't force him back east now. It's done." Coulter cursed under his breath, but the fight had gone out of him. People began to turn away, some muttering in disgust, some looking thoughtful, but no one was willing to argue with the sheriff's final word. Nathan's shoulders sagged with a relief so profound it was almost painful. Disbelief and a fragile, dawning hope warred in his eyes. Eliza threw her arms around him, crushing Sparrow between them. "See?" she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "I told you. I told you you were ours." Jacob's hands were trembling at his sides. The roar of the crowd was still ringing in his ears. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the storm had finally broken. The town wouldn't forget this. They might not forgive it for a long, long time. But the verdict had been delivered, not by ink or by law, but by the fierce love of a child and the desperate courage of a father. The train whistle screamed, a long, mournful cry. The eastbound train began to pull away from the station, leaving an empty space where Nathan was supposed to be. And Jacob knew there was no turning back. The boy was theirs now, bound not by a ledger but by a promise shouted in the face of the world. The train's whistle faded into the vast empty prairie, its smoke a gray smear against the blue sky. It was like a broken promise the town had meant to keep, but couldn't. The platform emptied out slowly. The air was thick with buzzing whispers, some still sharp with judgment, others softened with a grudging respect. But no voice was louder than Eliza's, a steady, triumphant murmur as she clung to Nathan's hand. Jacob guided them through the last of the thinning crowd, his shoulders squared against the weight of 100 stairs. Nathan walked beside him now, not behind. He moved like a boy in a dream, his other hand still clutching the torn ticket. It trembled less now. It felt less like a sentence and more like a pardon. Back at the ranch, the silence in the small house felt different. The fear was gone. In its place was something heavy, but solid. Something like a foundation. Jacob hung his hat on its peg. His eyes fell on Nathan, who was lingering by the door, still afraid to step all the way in, as if the welcome might be revoked at any moment. Eliza tugged him inside, her face bright with victory. Sparrow was tucked firmly under her arm. "You see, Papa didn't let them take you," she said, her voice ringing with certainty. "Now you're home." Nathan blinked. Home. It was a word he hadn't dared to even think in years. He held out the ticket, its edges frayed and soft from being held so tightly. He offered it to Jacob like it was an apology. "It's all I had," he whispered, "but it's not mine anymore." Jacob reached out and took the small slip of paper. His hands were calloused from work, but his touch was gentle. He stared at it for a long moment, at the smudged ink in the torn corner. Then he crossed the room to the rough-hewn mantel where a heavy family Bible sat. Its leather cover was worn smooth from generations of hands seeking comfort in the dark. He opened the book to the front, where a family tree was written in elegant, fading script. He carefully slid the ticket inside, right beside the names of his wife and his parents and their parents before them. He closed the book. The sound was quiet, but it was filled with a weighty finality. "It belongs here now," he said, his voice low but steady. Nathan's breath hitched. Tears welled in his eyes as he understood. The ticket wasn't just a piece of paper anymore. It was a covenant. It was a promise. Eliza clapped her hands once, a sharp, delighted sound in the quiet room. She hugged Sparrow to her chest. "Now he can never leave," she said, with the unshakable faith that only a child possesses. Jacob's gaze softened as he looked at them. His daughter who had lost her mother too soon. The boy who had nearly lost the entire world. He had been so afraid to open his heart again, so terrified of inviting sorrow back through his door. But watching them now, their small hands linked together, he felt something stronger than fear. He felt hope. Nathan looked up at him, his voice barely a whisper. Does this mean I can call you?" The question hung in the air, fragile and trembling. Jacob knelt down so he was on their level. He placed one hand on the boy's thin shoulder and brushed a stray piece of hair from his daughter's forehead with the other. "It means you're mine," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Same as her. You call me whatever your heart tells you to." The boy swallowed hard, his lips trembling, and then he whispered the word, "Papa." It was so faint it was almost lost in the crackle of the fire, but to Jacob it was the loudest, most beautiful sound in the world. Eliza beamed. She pressed her doll Sparrow into Nathan's arms, as if she were sealing the vow. Jacob closed his eyes. The ache in his chest was still there, but it wasn't the ache of grief anymore. It was the ache of something breaking open, something new being born, something strong enough to hold them all. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying away the last echoes of the train. Inside, a torn ticket rested safely in a family Bible. It was no longer a mark of exile. It was a proof of belonging. Jacob rose and drew both children into his arms, holding them tight. "This house will stand against any storm," he said, his voice rough but sure. "Let the town talk. We know the truth." And in that moment, with the firelight glowing on their faces and the Bible standing closed on the mantel, its precious secret held safe inside, Nathan finally understood. The ledger had been wrong. The world had been wrong, because some things aren't written in ink. They're written in love. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to Echoes of the West for more tales of courage and heart. Let us know in the comments. If you saw a child left all alone on that platform, what would you have done?